The mystery of JFK's brain. How did it disappear? Dallas, November 22, 1963. The autumn sun glinted off the chrome of the presidential limousine as it turned onto Elm Street. The crowds that lined the street cheered as President John F. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline waved from the back seat. Governor John Connally and his wife sat in front of them. Secret Service agent Clint Hill stood on the running board of the car following directly behind. It was 12:30 p.m. in Dallas. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. The president slumped forward, then violently backward as the second bullet struck him in the head. In that horrific instant, as brain matter and blood sprayed across the back of the limousine, the course of American history changed forever. Jackie Kennedy crawled onto the trunk of the car, reportedly reaching for a piece of her husband's skull. "My God, they've killed my husband," she cried. "I have his brains in my hand." Agent Hill leapt from his vehicle and sprinted toward the presidential limousine, throwing himself across the back to shield the First Lady as the car accelerated toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. What followed in the ensuing hours, days, and years would become one of the most scrutinized series of events in American history. Lost amid the questions about the shooter, the bullets, the angles, and the motives lies another mystery, perhaps the strangest of all. What happened to the brain of John F. Kennedy? Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dallas, Texas. Dr. Charles Carrico met the presidential limousine at the emergency entrance. The scene was chaos. Secret Service agents shouting orders, Mrs. Kennedy in shock, her pink suit spattered with blood and brain matter. The president was rushed into Trauma Room 1. His head wound was massive, Dr. Malcolm Perry would later recall. A large portion of the right cerebrum was missing, and some of the cerebellar tissue was hanging out from the wound. Despite their frantic efforts, John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. Against the wishes of Texas officials, who wanted the autopsy performed in their state, Secret Service agents whisked the president's body away. Armed with handguns, they prevented local medical examiners from completing the legally required autopsy. The body was loaded onto Air Force One, where Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Bethesda Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland. Later that evening, the official autopsy began at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Commander James J. Humes led a team of pathologists as they examined the fallen president's body. The scene was tense, crowded with military officers and federal agents observing the procedure. The right side of the brain was badly damaged, Dr. Humes noted in his report. A portion of the cerebellum was missing. The doctors removed what remained of Kennedy's brain, estimated to be approximately 1,500 grams before the shooting, but now weighing only about 1,000 grams. They placed it in a stainless steel container filled with formaldehyde. Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, took custody of the brain and other tissue samples. The plan was straightforward. The brain would be preserved and later examined by neuropathologists once it had properly fixed in formaldehyde. No one could have predicted that this preserved organ would become the center of one of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the assassination. The White House, Washington, D.C. In the days following the assassination, the nation mourned. Kennedy's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda as hundreds of thousands filed past to pay their respects. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on November 25, 1963, but his brain was not buried with him. Admiral Berkeley had transferred the stainless steel container holding the president's brain to the White House, where it was secured in a locked cabinet in the office of Secret Service Chief James Rowley. The brain was meant to be examined later by neuropathologists at a military facility. Dr. Humes performed supplemental microscopic examinations of brain tissue on December 6, 1963. He prepared slides and wrote a supplementary report. According to official records, the brain remained in the Secret Service's custody. Robert Buck, the head of the Protective Research Section of the Secret Service, would later testify that the brain and tissue slides were kept in a footlocker in his office. "I was responsible for the security of these materials," Buck explained to investigators years later. "They were treated with the utmost confidentiality." The National Archives, Washington, D.C. In April 1965, the Kennedy family, led by Robert F. Kennedy, the late president's brother and now a U.S. Senator from New York, made a decision. They wanted all materials related to the assassination transferred to the National Archives. On April 26, 1965, the brain specimens, slides, and other autopsy materials were transferred to the Office of the National Archives. Robert Kennedy's assistant, Angela Novello, signed the receipt for these materials. Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's former secretary, delivered the materials personally to the archives. They were placed in a secure room that housed other sensitive materials related to the assassination. "We created a detailed inventory of everything received," Archives technician Robert Balmer would later state. "The brain specimens were recorded as being present at that time. Everything seemed to be proceeding properly. The brain was preserved, documented, and secured for future study and historical record. But when archivists conducted an inventory in October 1966, they made a shocking discovery. The brain of the 35th President of the United States had vanished." National Archives, October 1966. Archives technician Jacqueline Hess pulled the inventory list and began checking off items one by one. The supplementary autopsy report on the brain examination was there. The microscopic slides of brain tissue were present, but the stainless steel container holding the actual brain was gone. Hess alerted her superiors immediately. "It wasn't just misplaced," she would later tell investigators. "We searched every secure area. It was simply not there anymore." No signs of forced entry were found. The security logs showed no unauthorized access. The brain had seemingly disappeared without a trace. Initially, the disappearance was kept quiet. No public announcement was made. The archives staff hoped the missing specimen would turn up in another storage area, or that paperwork would surface explaining its relocation. It never did. House Select Committee on Assassinations, 1977. Nearly a decade passed before the disappearance became public knowledge. In 1976, the House of Representatives established the House Select Committee on Assassinations to investigate the murders of President Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During their investigation, committee researchers discovered the absence of the brain while reviewing archive records. This revelation prompted a formal inquiry into the missing specimen. The committee's investigators interviewed approximately 40 people who had access to or knowledge of the autopsy materials. None could provide definitive information about what had happened to the brain. "It was like it had vanished into thin air," said investigator Andy Purdy. Nobody would admit to knowing anything about its removal or current whereabouts. This was no small matter. The brain was not just a biological specimen. It was potentially crucial evidence. Examination of the preserved brain might have answered lingering questions about the trajectory of the bullets and potentially confirmed or refuted aspects of the Warren Commission's conclusions. Theory 1. Administrative error. The simplest explanation was that the brain had been misplaced due to administrative error. Perhaps it had been transferred to another facility for examination, and the paperwork was lost or misfiled. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist who served as a consultant to the House Select Committee, found this explanation unconvincing. "This wasn't a routine specimen," Dr. Wecht explained during an interview in his Pittsburgh office. "This was the brain of a murdered president. The chain of custody would have been meticulously documented. It's inconceivable that it would simply be misplaced." Records showed that the brain had been properly logged into the archives in 1965. No documentation authorized its removal. The paper trail simply ended. Theory 2. The Kennedy family intervention. A more compelling theory emerged during the committee's investigation. Multiple witnesses suggested that Robert Kennedy, acting on behalf of the Kennedy family, had removed the brain from the archives. Evelyn Lincoln, JFK's secretary, told investigators that Robert Kennedy was deeply concerned about what would happen to his brother's autopsy materials once they were transferred to the archives. He feared they might eventually become public, violating the family's privacy and dignity. "Bobby was protective of his brother's legacy," said Pierre Salinger, JFK's press secretary. "He was haunted by the thought of his brother's remains becoming a public spectacle." This theory gained further credence when researchers discovered that Robert Kennedy had made several unannounced visits to the archives in 1965 and early 1966. Theory 3. Government cover-up. For conspiracy theorists, the missing brain represented something more sinister, evidence of a government cover-up. The brain could have proven whether the fatal shot came from the front or the rear, explained Fletcher Prouty, a former Air Force colonel who worked with the CIA. If it showed evidence of a frontal entry wound, it would have contradicted the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Some theorized that government agents removed the brain to prevent further examination that might reveal inconsistencies with the official narrative. Dr. James Fetzer, a conspiracy researcher, pointed to discrepancies in the autopsy reports. The doctors at Parkland described a large exit wound at the back of the head, while the Bethesda autopsy described the wound differently. The brain could have resolved this contradiction. Theory 4. Medical evidence concealment. A variation on the family intervention theory emerged in 2013 when historian James L. Swanson published End of Days: The Assassination of John F. Kennedy. Swanson proposed that Robert Kennedy took the brain not to protect his brother's dignity, but to conceal evidence of the president's medical conditions. John Kennedy suffered from numerous health problems throughout his life, including Addison's disease and chronic back pain. He received regular injections of amphetamines, steroids, and painkillers from Dr. Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood. Robert feared that examination of the brain might reveal the extent of the president's drug treatments. Swanson wrote, "This could have damaged JFK's legacy and the family's political future." While the brain tissue itself might not have contained evidence of drug use, the Kennedy family may not have understood this medical fact. Their concern was about perception, not reality. The Burke investigation. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations tasked investigator Purdy with solving the mystery of the missing brain. Purdy and his colleague, Michael Baden, spent months tracking down everyone who had access to the autopsy materials. One crucial interview was with Gerald Custer, an X-ray technician present at Kennedy's autopsy. Custer made a startling claim. There were 2 brain examinations, he told investigators. The first was with what was left of the president's actual brain. But the second exam, a week later, was with a different brain, a whole brain that couldn't have been Kennedy's. This allegation suggested something more troubling than a missing specimen. It hinted at evidence tampering. Dr. Baden was skeptical. "We found no credible evidence of a brain substitution," he stated in the committee's final report, "but we couldn't locate the actual brain either." Their investigation hit one dead end after another. White House Connections researchers then turned their attention to Evelyn Lincoln, who had maintained close ties to the Kennedy family after the assassination. Lincoln admitted to removing certain items from the White House at Robert Kennedy's request. He wanted to ensure some personal items weren't treated as government property, she explained. When pressed about the brain specifically, Lincoln became evasive. "I don't recall anything about that," she said repeatedly. Another intriguing lead came from William Manchester, author of The Death of a President. Manchester had unprecedented access to the Kennedy family and their inner circle while researching his book. In private notes later discovered by investigators, Manchester wrote, "RFK was determined that the autopsy materials would not fall into the wrong hands. He spoke of protecting Jack, even in death." National Archives, 1992. In 1992, the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act mandated the release of all government records related to the assassination. This prompted another systematic search of the archives. Archives technicians combed through every box, folder, and container that might hold the missing brain. They expanded their search to include other government facilities and presidential libraries. "We found previously undisclosed autopsy photographs and X-rays," said Archives Director John Carlin, "but no trace of the preserved brain itself." The search extended to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where records of all brain specimens were reviewed. Nothing matched Kennedy's. Private collectors and black market theories. Some investigators pursued the disturbing possibility that the brain had been stolen for its macabre historical value. Collectors of assassination memorabilia were quietly interviewed. "There are people who would pay millions for something like that," said a former FBI agent who requested anonymity. "It's gruesome, but the black market for historical artifacts is real." No credible evidence emerged to support this theory, however. No rumors in collector circles, no whispers in the underground market. If someone had stolen the brain for profit, they had kept it entirely secret. Hickory Hill, McLean, Virginia, 1966. The most compelling narrative that emerged from multiple investigations centered on Robert Kennedy and his actions in the months before the brain disappeared. According to this account, reconstructed from witness testimonies and circumstantial evidence, Robert Kennedy made a decision sometime in early 1966. JFK's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, reportedly received a call from Robert Kennedy in early October 1966. Kennedy asked her to help him retrieve something from the archives, something related to his brother's autopsy. Lincoln, who maintained an office at the archives where she organized JFK's presidential papers, had the access and authority to facilitate such a request. On a quiet evening, possibly accompanied by Kennedy's confidant Justice Department aide John Nolan, Robert Kennedy allegedly entered the archives and removed the container with his brother's brain. He believed it was a family matter, not government property, suggested historian William Manchester in a private interview years later. In his mind, he was simply claiming what belonged to the Kennedys. The final resting place. If Robert Kennedy did indeed remove the brain, what did he do with it? Some theories suggest he had it secretly buried with other family remains at Arlington National Cemetery. Others believe he may have had it cremated or buried at sea. Bobby was deeply religious, noted Kennedy family historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He would have wanted Jack's remains treated with proper Catholic respect. The timing is notable. The removal occurred just as questions about the assassination were intensifying. Books challenging the Warren Commission's findings were gaining popularity. Researchers were seeking access to the autopsy materials. It was a perfect time to act if he wanted to prevent further examination, observed assassination researcher Josiah Thompson. Robert Kennedy never addressed the matter publicly. If he did remove the brain, he took the secret to his grave when he was assassinated in June 1968. What could the brain have told us? Beyond the mystery of its disappearance lies a deeper question. What might examination of Kennedy's preserved brain have revealed? Dr. Michael Chesser, a neurosurgeon who studied the available autopsy materials, explained the potential significance. The pattern of damage could have definitively established the bullet's path, he said. Modern forensic techniques unavailable in 1963 might have determined whether the fatal shot came from behind, as the Warren Commission concluded, or from the front, as some witnesses claimed. The brain might also have contained metal fragments that could have been matched to specific ammunition. Dr. Werner Spitz, a forensic pathologist who served on the House Select Committee's medical panel, was more skeptical. Given the extensive damage and the limited preservation techniques of the time, I doubt the brain would have provided conclusive evidence one way or the other, he argued. The mystery of its disappearance has probably become more significant than any evidence it might have contained. National Archives, present day. Today, in a climate-controlled room at the National Archives, the remaining autopsy materials from President Kennedy's examination are stored in acid-free containers. Photographs of the brain taken during the autopsy remain, as do microscopic slides of brain tissue, but the brain itself is still missing. We maintain the collection as it exists, explained archives technician Martha Murphy. The brain isn't listed in our current inventory, but the documentation of its absence is part of the historical record. Researchers can access the available materials only through specific authorization. The Kennedy family retains certain rights over who can view the autopsy photographs and X-rays. It's a balance between historical transparency and family privacy, Murphy noted. These aren't just historical artifacts, they're the remains of a beloved family member. The growing distrust. The disappearance of Kennedy's brain fed into growing public skepticism about the official account of the assassination. As polls consistently show, a majority of Americans believe there was more to Kennedy's murder than the Warren Commission revealed. A 1998 CBS News poll indicated that 76% of Americans believed significant information about the assassination had been withheld. By 2013, when the 50th anniversary of the assassination approached, a Gallup poll found that 61% believed in some form of conspiracy. The missing brain became a metaphor for the larger questions about the assassination, explained Jeff Morley, an author who has written extensively about JFK's death. It represents what the public perceives as hidden or concealed truth. The brain's disappearance has been featured in countless books, documentaries, and websites dedicated to assassination theories. It has become part of American folklore, a tangible symbol of unanswered questions. The historical context. Some historians place the missing brain in the broader context of the 1960s, a decade that saw growing distrust in government institutions. The Kennedy assassination came just before Vietnam and Watergate, noted presidential historian Douglas Brinkley. These events collectively shattered Americans' trust in their government. The missing brain fits into that narrative of concealment and deception. Others see it differently. Historian Max Holland has argued that the focus on mysteries like the missing brain distracts from the established facts of the case. Oswald's guilt is supported by overwhelming evidence, Holland stated. The obsession with peripheral mysteries has prevented closure on the central question of who killed Kennedy. Department of Justice Review, 1998. In 1998, as interest in the assassination surged again with the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK, the Department of Justice conducted a limited review of the missing brain evidence. We found no evidence of criminal activity related to the brain's disappearance, concluded Assistant Attorney General Ronald Kupfer. The preponderance of evidence suggests it was removed by someone with legitimate access, most likely at the request of the Kennedy family. This conclusion satisfied few. Critics pointed out that no Kennedy family member had ever publicly admitted to removing the brain or revealing its location. The Assassination Records Review Board. From 1994 to 1998, the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, collected and released thousands of documents related to the assassination. They too investigated the missing brain. ARRB Chief Counsel Jeremy Gunn interviewed numerous witnesses, including Sandra Spencer, a Navy photographer who developed autopsy photos. Spencer made a startling claim. The official autopsy photos she saw in the 1990s were not the ones she developed in 1963. The wound I recall was much larger than what's shown in these photos, she testified. This raised the possibility that evidence beyond just the brain had been altered or removed. Dr. James Humes, who performed the autopsy, added another layer of mystery when he admitted to burning his preliminary autopsy notes in his fireplace. "I didn't want them to become a public curiosity," he explained. These revelations only deepened public suspicion about the handling of medical evidence, the Secret Service perspective. Robert Booke, the Secret Service agent responsible for the autopsy materials before their transfer to the archives, maintained that proper protocols were followed under extraordinary circumstances. "We were operating in uncharted territory," Booke told investigators. "There was no precedent for handling the assassination of a president in the modern era." When asked about Robert Kennedy's interest in the autopsy materials, Booke acknowledged that the Attorney General had expressed concerns about their disposition. He wanted assurance that his brother's remains would be treated with dignity, Booke recalled. That seemed entirely appropriate given the circumstances. The medical examiner's view, Dr. J. Thornton Boswell, who assisted in the autopsy, expressed frustration with how the medical evidence had been handled. "We were military doctors following orders," he said in a 1996 interview. "There were too many people in the autopsy room, too many agencies involved, too much confusion." When asked directly about the brain's examination, Dr. Boswell was clear. "We preserved it properly for further study. What happened after it left our custody, I cannot say." Dr. Pierre Fink, the third autopsy physician, noted in a memorandum that the brain examination had been delayed to allow for proper fixation in formaldehyde. "This is standard procedure," he wrote. "The brain needs to harden sufficiently to allow proper sectioning. This takes weeks, not days." This explanation accounts for why the brain was not examined immediately, but not for its subsequent disappearance. The research community divided. The professional skeptics. The community of JFK researchers remains divided on the significance of the missing brain. Professor Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, which supports the Warren Commission's conclusions, downplays its importance. The brain's absence is unfortunate but not sinister, Posner argued. The autopsy photos and X-rays that do exist are sufficient to establish that Kennedy was shot from behind, consistent with Oswald firing from the book depository. Posner suggests that the Kennedy family's likely removal of the brain was motivated by privacy concerns, not fear of what further examination might reveal. The conspiracy researchers. On the other side stand researchers like Dr. Cyril Wecht, who see the missing brain as a crucial piece of concealed evidence. The brain could have settled the debate about the bullet's trajectory once and for all, Wecht insisted. Its disappearance prevents independent verification of the Warren Commission's claims. Author David Lifton went further in his book, Best Evidence, suggesting that Kennedy's body itself was altered before the official autopsy to conceal evidence of shots from the front. The missing brain is just one part of a larger pattern of evidence tampering, Lifton claimed. The middle ground. Between these extremes are researchers like Jefferson Morley, who maintain that questions about the assassination remain unanswered without suggesting a specific alternative theory. The official investigations were flawed, Morley concluded after decades of research. Too many witnesses were never called, too many leads never followed, too many records kept secret for too long. The missing brain, in Morley's view, exemplifies this larger pattern of incomplete investigation. The Kennedy family's silence, the code of privacy. Throughout the decades of controversy, the Kennedy family has maintained near-complete silence about the brain's disappearance. No family member has ever publicly addressed the matter directly. This silence aligns with the family's general approach to JFK's assassination. They accepted the Warren Commission's findings publicly while privately harboring doubts. Robert Kennedy confided to several close friends that he suspected a conspiracy involving organized crime, possibly as retribution for his aggressive prosecutions as Attorney General. Bobby believed there was more to it, revealed Richard Goodwin, a Kennedy speechwriter. But he felt powerless to pursue it while Lyndon Johnson was president. If Robert Kennedy did remove the brain to protect family privacy or his brother's legacy, he never admitted it. After his own assassination in 1968, the secret, if he held it, died with him. Senator Edward Kennedy's role. Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, who became the family patriarch after Robert's death, consistently deflected questions about assassination controversies. When the House Select Committee sought his testimony in the 1970s, he declined to appear. When new investigations were proposed in Congress, he remained neutral, neither supporting nor opposing them. For the Kennedy family, closure was more important than endless investigation, observed Kennedy family biographer Lawrence Leamer. They chose to focus on carrying forward JFK's legacy rather than looking back at the tragedy of his death. This stance frustrated investigators, but was consistent with how the family handled other tragedies, from Chappaquiddick to John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crash. Private grief was not for public consumption. The final theories. The family protection theory. The most widely accepted explanation among serious historians is that Robert Kennedy, acting on behalf of the family, removed the brain and either had it buried separately or destroyed. This theory is supported by Robert Kennedy's documented concern about the autopsy materials, his visits to the National Archives during the relevant time period, the timing of the disappearance, which coincided with growing public questioning of the Warren report, multiple witness statements that he wanted to protect his brother's dignity and death, the lack of evidence suggesting theft or official malfeasance. Historian James Swanson elaborated on this theory in his 2013 book, suggesting that Kennedy was specifically concerned about evidence of the president's medical conditions and drug treatments. Robert Kennedy was thinking of history and his brother's place in it, Swanson wrote. He didn't want future generations focusing on JFK's physical ailments rather than his accomplishments. The evidence concealment theory. The alternative view, favored by many conspiracy researchers, is that the brain was removed by government officials to conceal evidence contradicting the official account of the assassination. This theory points to inconsistencies between the Dallas doctor's observations and the official autopsy report. The unusual circumstances of the autopsy itself, conducted under military rather than civilian authority. The destruction of original autopsy notes by Dr. Hume's claims by some witnesses that the autopsy photos were altered. The government's decades-long secrecy about assassination records. If the brain showed evidence of a shot from the front, it would have proven conspiracy, argued assassination researcher Robert Groden. Its disappearance is too convenient to be coincidental. More than 6 decades after John F. Kennedy's assassination, his missing brain remains one of history's strangest, unsolved mysteries. It stands as a symbol of the larger questions that continue to surround his death, questions that may never be fully answered. In the National Archives, the remaining autopsy materials sit in their acid-free containers. Researchers still petition for access. Books and documentaries still debate the significance of the missing specimen. Online forums buzz with theories ranging from the credible to the fantastical. For most Americans, the disappearance of JFK's brain fits into a larger narrative about their government and its secrets. The fact that something so basic, the physical evidence from a presidential assassination, could simply vanish has contributed to a legacy of distrust that extends far beyond this single event. Perhaps the brain was removed by a grieving brother seeking to protect family dignity. Perhaps it was taken to conceal medical secrets. Perhaps it was removed to hide evidence of conspiracy. Or perhaps the truth is something else entirely, something not yet considered in the decades of investigation and speculation. What remains certain is the impact of this mystery on American culture and politics. It has become more than a historical footnote. It is a metaphor for uncertainty, for unanswered questions, for the sense that beneath the surface of official narratives lie deeper, hidden truths. The brain of John F. Kennedy, wherever it may be, carries with it a lesson about history itself. That even in an age of information and transparency, some secrets remain buried, some questions unanswered, some mysteries unsolved. And perhaps that is fitting for a president who himself remains something of an enigma, a complex man whose brief shining moment in American history was cut tragically short, leaving behind both a legacy of hope and a shadow of unanswered questions.